Okay, some people are still coming into our webinar, but it's 12:31 according to my computer, so let's start today's webinar. So dear participants, good afternoon and welcome to the international webinar on Seabased Measures. Almost 200 people from the Baltic Sea region and also outside have announced themselves to this webinar, which shows that the topic raises wide interest. So we are very happy and excited to have you all here today. My name is Marjukka Porvari, and I am the director of the Clean Baltic Sea projects of the John Nurminen Foundation, and I will be your official talk show host today. All right, let's move to today's program. You can see it on the screen. So the first part of the webinar will focus on the role of internal nutrient load in the Baltic Sea and presentations on results of our sea-based pilots. Then we will have a pilot discussion. Just before 3, we will have a short break, and the second part of the webinar today will focus on the main outcomes of the project as well as aquatic compensations, and then we will have also some time for free discussion in the end. But now, without further ado, we will now hear some welcoming words by John Nurminen Foundation's CEO, Annamari Arrakoski-Engardt, who will tell you how and why the John Nurminen Foundation decided to initiate the Seabased project. Welcome, Annamari. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjukka. Dear friends, good afternoon from the snowy Helsinki and welcome. Before we jump to the underwater world, I want to tell you briefly how a Finnish private foundation became involved with Seabased Measures. Our foundation started its work in 1992 as a cultural foundation, safeguarding the marine cultural heritage for future generations. Since 2005, we have also worked with Baltic Sea protection, with a focus on concrete measures to reduce nutrient load from land to the Baltic Sea. We have reduced load to the sea source by source, starting with the largest sources, which was the most cost-efficient way. Our nutrient reduction work began with the large point source polluters in the municipal wastewater treatment plants of St. Petersburg and other cities in Russia, Poland, Baltic states and Belarus. In 2012, our work expanded to industrial point sources as we started our project with the phosphorus fertilizer plant at the Luga River in Kingisepp, Russia. 5 years ago, a whole new line of action was started when we launched our first project to reduce load from diffuse sources by treating agricultural fields with gypsum. At the same time, we started something totally new for us and very ancient as such, namely a fishing project. We recycled and took out nutrients from the sea and produced delicious fish patties to consumer plates. Mainly, those patties were made mainly from bream and breech. Fishing in the Archipelago Sea was our first dip to the underwater world and the first time when we, instead of reducing nutrient load from land-based sources, were taking up nutrients directly from the sea. Our dip to sea-based measures in the form of fishing, combined with somewhat depressing research results about the increasing role of internal nutrient loading in the Baltic Sea, and claims that some sea-based measures might already be equally cost-efficient with land-based measures, led us to investigate the field. However, it proved to be very difficult to find information on the true efficiency of most sea-based measures. That is why we decided to initiate a project in which we would gather information on these measures to benefit a larger group of stakeholders and at the same time test some of the promising measures for which there was still little information available. We couldn't have completed our 3 years underwater journey without the dedicated and open-minded partner organizations and people from Sweden, Åland Islands and Finland. Moreover, our co-financer, the Interreg Central Baltic program, was willing to finance our endeavor and dive bravely into the depths of the sea with us. The reason for the great interest on sea-based measures is, of course, that they give us hope. Hope on the recovery of our suffering sea. I want to point out that the work with land-based sources must continue. However, are there any ways to help the sea to recover by reducing the nutrient legacy which has entered the sea? Today's webinar will provide answers and insights to this question. I hope you enjoy this afternoon's underwater dive to the sea-based world.
Thank you, Annamari. Now I welcome to the virtual scene our keynote speaker, Senior Research Scientist Jouni Lehtoranta, who will tell us about internal nutrient load in Baltic Sea. Jouni, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjukka. Yeah, it is really a pleasure to have this kind of keynote presentation on this internal nutrient load in the Baltic Sea. And the topic of my presentation is internal nutrient load in the Baltic Sea. But first, I would like to take you back to school. So, what is a biogeochemical cycle? It is a cycle where element is transferred between biotic and abiotic systems. So here in this figure, there is this abiotic environment with the yellow color, and then this biotic environment is with the blue and green boxes inside this yellow line. And what is important is that there are fluxes between this abiotic environment and then this biotic environment. So this system biotic environment takes up nutrients and it puts them back into this abiotic environment. Okay, next. You can change the slide.
Yeah, there seems to be a bit of a lag.
Yeah, there seems to be a time lag. Okay, let's wait for a while. But what I'm going to say next is that we can go through some terms. So if we are talking about, for example, a reservoir, it is a place where this nutrient is held for a really long time. So, for example, some apatite deposits can be considered as reservoirs. And then there are also these exchange pools, which can be considered as places where this molecule is held for pretty short times. And then there is a residence time. And this residence time is usually very short in this biotic environment, and it is very long in this abiotic environment. Okay.
Jouni, if you can't see the right slide, please just click the back to presenter or something like that. Then it should show the same as the audience sees.
Where is back to presenter?
It should be up next to the slide numbers.
Okay. So next, please. So then phosphorus pools and balance in the Baltic Sea. So the accumulation during the decades or last decades, it shows that there is over 40 million tons of phosphorus accumulated on the fields on the catchment of the Baltic Sea. And catchment loading annually at present is about 30,000 tons annually. And the export through Danish Straits, it's about 3,000 tons. So it means that 90% of this loading is retained in the Baltic Sea system. And in the water of the Baltic Sea, it is estimated that there is about 600,000 tons of phosphorus. And in the sediment exchange pool, there is a 1.6 million tons. And what is important here is that what are the changes in this pool size in water and in this exchange pool. Okay, next slide, please. So we can do so that we can look at this biogeochemical cycle as in the Baltic Sea system and look at the fluxes between the sediment and water. Let's take the next figure. And what it means that if we have these kind of fluxes, it means that we have reactions in water which capture the bioavailable phosphorus into form of organic matter as an algae, especially during springtime. And that algae are sedimented on the bottom. And then we have reactions in the sediment which transport this nutrient as in bioavailable form back into the water. So these are very large fluxes inside the system. And the next slide, please. And why the sediment of Baltic Sea leaks phosphorus? There are three main reasons for this. First of all, we have had high loading of phosphorus, and that means that we have a lot of phosphorus retained in the sediment or bottom sediment of the Baltic Sea. And what else is that the eutrophication has increased the organic matter content in the sediment. And that's why there is a lot of energy or fuel to carry out the unfavorable reactions in the sediment. And that's why we have a high potential for release of phosphorus from the sediment to water. And third is that in the Baltic Sea, in the main basin, we have exceptional stratification properties. And that means that the oxygen is not transported down to the bottom waters as efficiently as in other systems. And that's why in the main basin, especially there, we have sensitivity towards anoxia and also phosphorus release from the sediment. So in the Baltic Sea sediment, it is nowadays actually an exchange pool rather than a reservoir, which we want it to be. Okay, next slide. So as a result, there is an interesting situation in the Baltic Sea. It means that this red line there shows the loading from the land, and it has decreased from the 80s to this 30,000 level during nowadays. And at the same time, this other thing is that the pool size in the water has increased at the same time. So due to these great fluxes between the sediment and water, we may have a decreasing loading simultaneously with the increasing phosphorus concentration in water. Okay, next. So what can we do? Or how this retention in the sediment can be improved? We can improve the binding of phosphorus when the amount of organic matter decreases, and these favorable reactions improve the retention of phosphorus. And actually this is the main mechanism how we think that these reductions from the land would affect this retention of phosphorus in the sediment. And then the retention of phosphorus can be increased when weather conditions, they weaken the stratification and improve the oxygen conditions. And these kind of conditions, they favor the retention of phosphorus in the bottom sediments of the Baltic Sea. And then third is that there are natural reactions in the sediment which enhance the phosphorus binding to calcium or aluminum compounds. But this is something which is not occurring efficiently in the Baltic Sea sediment nowadays. Okay, next. So then we can think of these internal measures which are aimed to decrease the sediment phosphorus release. And they are based on following three main mechanisms. So this measure, it can improve the geochemical conditions so that phosphorus is retained in bottom sediments. And with these geochemical conditions, I mean here that there are processes or reactions which increase, for example, the amount of iron oxides which efficiently bind phosphorus in the sediment. So, for example, the increase in oxygen concentrations means that that improves the conditions for formation of iron oxides and binding of phosphorus. And then we can add phosphorus binding compounds in the sediments, and they can be aluminum compounds, or they can be lanthanum or something else which binds phosphorus. And third is that we simply remove the phosphorus from the system. Okay, next. So why we are now thinking of these sea-based measures as one possibility to improve the status of the Baltic or some areas of the Baltic is that the point source nutrient loading, it will be largely under control. And this management of diffuse source loading, it is still challenging. And third thing is that this climate change, it may increase unfavorable weather conditions, which may enhance the release of phosphorus from the bottom sediment into the water. So under these present day pressures, it is reasonable to study and test these sea-based measures and inform the stakeholders on their feasibility. And next. Yes, thank you. And I think that next we will hear about the results of the tests and experiments which were carried out in the SEABASED project to improve the conditions in some sub-basins. Thank you.
Thank you, Jouni. I don't see any questions from the audience. Please be brave and ask Because if you don't ask, I have to ask. So I'm going to ask a question to encourage you to ask questions. So Jouni, we didn't try oxygenation in our SEABASED project, but you have participated in the proppen oxygenation experiment, and we know that oxygenation has been used for over 40 years in the Finnish and Swedish lakes, but how do you see its potential in Baltic Sea recovery and protection?
Yeah, we had two different sites. One was in archipelago of Stockholm and one was in archipelago of southern Finland. And we did succeed in archipelago of the Stockholm, but we didn't succeed that well in Sandefjärden basin in Finland. And one of the good things in this oxygenation was that we were able to create conditions where let's say, the transport of oxic water from the adjacent areas could keep up the oxygen concentrations high in the treated area. And the problem in the Sandefjärden area was that we probably increased the temperature or heated the water there, and the oxygen situation was not improved in that area. But one thing what we have to keep in mind in this kind of oxygenation project is that the physics or hydrodynamics, they always try to find their natural conditions in the system. And if we change those conditions, we have to continue this changing because or control it somehow through the years, because if it tries to stabilize itself back into these natural conditions, then there is always a risk to go back in this poor oxygen situation in the place.
Yeah, thank you. I see someone brave asking now something, so we have time at least for one question now to Jouni. So let's start with the first one I got. Why would the internal load be increasing rather than remaining fairly constant and fluctuate over seasons?
Could you repeat?
Why would the internal load be increasing rather than remaining fairly constant and fluctuate over seasons? So why is it increasing, or why would it be increasing instead of, I understand this question so that why do we think it's increasing as a whole instead of just, we are seeing seasonal fluctuation? What is the reason behind?
Yeah, I think that I understood the question. Of course, the internal loading is a result of external loading. And if we are able to decrease the external loading, the internal loading will eventually decrease. But for example, why the conditions in the Baltic Sea have gone worse at the same time when we have reduced the loading is that these hydrodynamical conditions have favored the release of phosphorus from the bottom sediments. And in future, it will be really important to study and find out what will be the effect of this climate change on hydrodynamics. Will they produce some conditions with unfavorable, or could it be that some of these conditions are even favorable for this retention of phosphorus in the sediment?
Now the questions are coming, so let's take at least one more to Jouni. Have you looked at results from other parts of the world where eutrophication is a problem and where sea-based measures have been tried? So the international context.
Well, not much, but what I've been looking at is that for example, this sediment removal, it seems to be quite a difficult measure, because when you take up the sediment out from the system, it seems to be so that it is quite fast covered again with this loose and organic rich sediment, and that's why this measure is not that efficient as it with the first glance it seems to be. And with this oxygenation project, there are again some places they have succeeded well, and in some other places not.
Yeah. Thank you, Jouni. I think we need to rush forward. We now got some more questions, and we will look if we have time to answer this later on. But thank you, Jouni, for your deep and heavy dive into sediment. So next we will go into our sea-based pilot results by our project partners. And the first results we will hear from Åland by Annika Brink from Government of Åland. So Annika, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjukka. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So my name is Annika Brink, and I'm the project coordinator for the pilot activity here in Åland called Nutrients from Sea to Field, which I will talk about today. So first of all, what did we do? We have been irrigating fields with nutrient-rich brackish water from bays with bad ecological status. And this presented a win-win solution, as we could get rid of some nutrients from the Baltic Sea, and at the same time, we could provide water for the crops. We did this during the summer 2019 and 2020, and we had an extensive monitoring program where we monitored the bay water, irrigation water, and the ley, that is the grass, soil, and groundwater. Let's have a look at our two pilot sites, Kaldersfjärden and Ämnäsviken. On the map, they are marked with the first letters. So they are more or less in the middle of Åland. And Kaldersfjärden has a maximum depth of 6.3 meters and is stratified during summer. The farmer there grows organic ley with no fertilization, and you can see the field just on top of Kaldersfjärden marked with white lines. The water inlet is positioned at 3.5 meters depth and is marked on the map with a white dot, and the water pipeline is the dashed white line that you can see. This farmer irrigated 4 times 40 millimeters for every summer. And then Ämnäsviken, the larger bay, has a maximum depth of 2.9 meters, so it's very shallow and wind mixed. And the farmer there next to Ämnäsviken, he grows ley as well, and he fertilizes artificially. Here the water inlet is set at 0.5 meters depth, and this farmer irrigated 2 times for every season. If we take a closer look at the field by Kaldersfjärden, you can see that it has a combined pilot area of 2.7 hectares, and the control area is 1.3 hectares. And the field by Ämnäsviken is a bit larger. It has a pilot area of 7.4 hectares and a control area of 2.6 hectares. So how much did we bring up from the bays? Well, for the 2 years and for the 2 bays, in total, we removed 3 kilograms of phosphorus and 31 kilograms of nitrogen. And these numbers may not seem so much when you look at them in kilograms, but if we put them into perspective on how much we would need to remove in order to achieve good ecological status, according to the Water Framework Directive, then the numbers seem much more optimistic. From Kaldersfjärden, every year, we removed about 6% of the needed removal for both nitrogen and phosphorus. And for Ämnäsviken, the number is 1% for both nitrogen and phosphorus. These calculations are very simplified and they are based on the SMHI coastal zone model, but they still give a rough indication on the potential impact of this pilot activity. And how much of the nutrients actually ended up on the fields? Well, for the both years, on Kaldersfjärden, we put 5.9 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And for phosphorus, we put 0.5 kilograms per hectare. In Ämnäsviken, we put about 2 kilograms of nitrogen on the fields and 0.2 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare. As you can also see in the right column, we put quite a lot of salt on the fields, about 1 kilogram per square meter over the 2 years. And this leads us on to what happened with the salt. One of our main concerns was if the salt can reach the groundwater, and it turns out that it can. So to investigate this, we drilled 2 groundwater tubes at the pilot site, groundwater tube 1 and 2. At the control site, we had a reference tube named groundwater tube 3. And we sampled the tubes in early summer and fall, and in 2020 also in the middle of the summer. But during the summer, we couldn't get a reference value because the tube was dry. As a threshold, we used the recommendation for private wells, where the chloride concentration should be below 100 milligrams per liter. And something to compare with is that around 300, you can start to feel the taste of salt in the water. So as you can see, in 2020, the concentration in groundwater tube 2 reached above the threshold and continued to increase throughout the summer. And in the fall, the concentration had increased also in groundwater tube number 1. So while these values are not alarmingly high, but they still raise a warning flag. We have to pay attention to our groundwater. And when irrigating with brackish water, we should take a pause in irrigation for a couple of years and to give the groundwater some time to restore itself. And what about the soil? Was it destroyed? What happened with the salt? Well, we looked at the soil fertility classes, and they are based on nutrient status of the soil. But here we couldn't see any apparent distinction between the pilot and the control sites. Then we also thought that the addition of sodium from the bay water might outcompete other cations in the soil, like cations like potassium and magnesium, for example. But it was the same here. We couldn't see any differences between the pilot and control site. Then we also thought that the addition of iron from the bay water might bind phosphate and make it unavailable for biological production. But also here, we couldn't see any distinction between the pilot and control site. But when we looked at the chloride, that is part of the salt from the bay water, then we noticed that we had a higher chloride content at the pilot site. But we're not too worried about this because chloride, chloride tends to wash out with precipitation. So we have a bit of a lag phase here, but if you stop the irrigation for 1 year, we should return to normal conditions, more or less. And then we also analyzed the crops, the silage, to see how that was. And here we had more or less similar characteristics between the pilot and the control site. But we did, however, observe that we had a lower amount of dry matter from the pilot site. And this is basically because the pilot site lay contained more water. We also got lower content of sugar in the pilot site. And this is quite good, actually, because just for humans, animals don't need too much sugar. And in the pilot site, we also could see that we got a higher content of sodium. And this is also quite a good thing because otherwise you would give extra sodium to cattle with these licking salt stones. And the crop production, well, it increased a lot actually. At the field by Kaldersfjärden, we had an increase of between 40 and 170%, depending on the harvest and the year. And for Ämnäsviken field, the percentage was 60 to 70%. So quite an increase. Here are also some visual results from Kaldersfjärden. On the left picture, you can see ley that has not been irrigated from the control site. And in the middle, you see ley that has been irrigated 4 times 40 millimeters. It looks much more green and lush. And the farmer said that even the roe deers prefer this one. Then you can see me and our farmer at Kaldersfjärden, Erik Rosenberg, and he was very happy about the project, especially the production outcome. So to conclude, some recommendations if you want to irrigate with brackish water. Brackish water can be used, but with caution for salinization of soil and groundwater. If possible, try to investigate the runoff pattern in the area so you know where the water ends up. And do not irrigate continuously year after year, but give the soil and groundwater a chance to restore itself. This is also something that you could do preferably during dry summers as a life support, a first aid for the crops. If possible, you can collect some samples for chloride analysis from the soil and the groundwater. And while it's quite expensive to drill groundwater tubes, perhaps there is a well in the vicinity that you can use. Also, I recommend to collect soil samples more often than the regular 5-year interval to keep track on the chloride. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. I don't have any questions in our chat box right now, but if not, I will ask a question from you. So how do you see the future of this kind of irrigation in Åland? Will it be used? How do you see it?
Annika, unmute yourself. I have to mute you because there was an echo.
Okay, sorry. Now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it has potential, but the main obstacle is that the equipment is very expensive. But if some farmers, for example, could share the equipment, or maybe some companies in the future will start to rent the equipment, because now you always buy the equipment, you don't rent it, then we can have some potential for this. There has been a few farmers that's been calling me and asked about the project, and they are interested in doing this, but they already have the equipment. But I mean, we are surrounded with a lot of bays here in Åland, so there is potential, absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of eutrophied bays and also need for irrigation water in summertime. So yes, thank you, Annika.
Thank you.
Now the next presenter will be Maria Gustafsson from County Administrative Board of Östergötland County. Maria, please.
Okay, I think it's working. Yes, okay. So my name is Maria Gustafsson and I work at the County Administration Board of Östergötland. And I'm going to show you our conclusions of this project and what we have been able to draw from all our measures. Because we did quite a few, see if I can change, quite a few measures in 3 bays and 1 lake. And the lake is close to the Baltic Sea, hence why we used it, because it's really eutrophicated as well. So we're going to start with what we did in the bay called Kyrkviken. It's up by Gryt, as you can see on the map, close to Valdemarsvik. And if I can change like that. So the first thing that we did in Kyrkviken was to spread marl to absorb phosphorus. And I'm not going to talk so much about this measure because Nils will later on go more thorough into the measure. But we spread marl in the deepest area of the bay, and we spread around 13 tons over 9 hectares. And that gives a little bit more than 100 grams per square meter. And we saw an effect in the beginning. 1 hour after the spreading, we saw that the phosphorus content decreased. But this wasn't a lasting effect. So after this and 1 year forward, we haven't seen any effect. But this was the first test with the marl, and Nils will talk more about it later on. In Kyrkviken, we also did this biomanipulation measure to remove sticklebacks. And Rosita will later on talk more about this measure, so I will not go in too deep in this either. But our results were that we only caught a few sticklebacks, and it was probably due to the season because we did it in November. And there weren't any sticklebacks in the bay then, but now we know that, so that was a lesson. But a side result was that we caught 8 tons of whitefish, mainly roach, bream, and eyed, and this resulted in that we still removed 60 kilograms of phosphorus and 200 kilograms of nitrogen from the bay. So that was at least that positive. So the conclusion of this is that to catch the stickleback in sheltered bays, it's important to do it during the right season and when they're more close to the shore, because they leave the shore during the season. But Rosita will talk more about these measures later on. The next one is in the lake called Djupsjön on top of the map. And here we did an irrigation pilot in the summer of 2020. And it was similar to what Annika did, but we had 2 test sites, quite small, but we compared the surface water and the bottom water, because it's quite common that you use lake water to irrigate your field. And we wanted to see, is it more difficult or does it cause any problems if you do it from the bottom water? So we had 2 sites, and you can see on the small map the deep area of the lake where we had the take-in and also the field. And we did 4 irrigations and we took 2 harvests. And it was the same amount that Annika used, the 40 millimeters times 4. And it gives that the bottom water was, the phosphorus content in the bottom water was around 200 to 340 micrograms per liter, and in the surface it was around 30 micrograms per liter. So you can say that if you look at the bottom site, we removed about 50 grams of phosphorus from the lake, and if in the surface site we removed about 7 kilograms of phosphorus. So the implications of this measure is that if you use the bottom water in a eutrophic lake, you could remove about 5 kilos of phosphorus from the lake per year if you have a field that is about 10 hectares. If you only use the surface water, you only remove about 0.5 kilograms of phosphorus per year. So the conclusion is that it's quite efficient to use bottom water instead of surface water if you look to the lake. And our conclusions is that it wasn't especially hard to use the bottom water instead of the surface water, because we placed the irrigation pump on a raft, and it worked. It was, I'm not going to say it was simple, but it worked really well. But the lesson to take is, if you're going to use this as a permanent solution for irrigation, you should place the pump on the shore, because otherwise you have to take a boat out to the raft every time you want to start the pump. So it's a little bit back and forth. But it's worked. Just place the pump on the shore instead, and then have the intake on the deep area of the lake, and it works, and it's a good measure for removing a little bit of extra phosphorus from the lake. If we go to Kattedalsfjärden, which are in the middle of the map, Kattedalsfjärden, we tried to do some pike factories, and it turned out to be more difficult than we thought. A pike factory you do to increase the spawning of pikes in the area, because the areas where the pikes can spawn have decreased in the later years, because we have ditched out our wetlands, so we don't have so many wetlands left. But we couldn't do any pike factories because we looked in 3 sites and investigated them thoroughly. But none of these 3 sites would hold water probably, because it demands that the wetland hold water long enough to the spawn to hatch and grow a little bit and then swim out. And none of these 3 sites were able to do that, so that was unfortunately. But we learned a lot of stuff from this, and when we found out that none of these sites would work, we looked into 3 other sites. None of them, we haven't done any pike factories on none of them right now, but 2 of them will be later on. So there was 3 sites out in the archipelago. One was on an island, and here we will probably and hopefully do a pike factory around 2032, because it was a much larger project than we had time to do in the Seabased project. But we will hope we will do a pike factory out here. And we also looked at the pike factory at Biogeochemical, but we think that this might actually be functional today. This was taken during the summer, so you doesn't see how it floods here, but we didn't want to do anything here because we think it might work as it is. And we looked at this called Humlekärret in Söderköping, and this will probably be a really nice pike factory, but it was too big of a project to manage in the Seabased project, but they have trying to fund it from another project on Lona. It's a local nature project from the Naturvårdsverket in Sweden. So this would probably be a nice pike factory in some years. So the conclusions we could draw from the pike factories are that there are efficient measures when placed correctly, and you really need to watch out so that the water stays long enough to not to hatch and to grow the baby pikes before it dries out. But we have posted a short manual on the website about placement and implementation, so you can go in and read more about that there. And the last measure. We also try to do some artificial reefs, because in this eutrophicated bays, a lot of the natural spawning areas for perch have disappeared over the years. So we tried to do some, in Swedish it is called risvasar. And it's an old measure. It's artificial reefs when you just tie some spruces together and you lower it in suitable areas in the bays, and the perch find a way quite immediately if you do it correctly. And we placed 10 of these in each bay, and it looked a little bit of this because the perch find it directly. And this is a simple measure, it's a cheap measure, and it's working. And we will do some more in Kattedalsfjärden this spring, because we see an effect of it immediately. So the conclusions here is that it's an efficient measure when you place it correctly in areas where the reproduction and spawning have decreased, because you can't place it too deep, because then it will be too dark and too low of an oxygen level to the spawn to hatch. So you have to place it correctly, and then it works nicely. And that were our measures. So I can take some questions.
Thank you, Maria. We have two questions and they both concern irrigation. I guess the first one was also partly for Annika, but I guess you can answer this for your part. So what is the economic feasibility compared to other types of irrigation and phosphorus and nitrogen fertilization of fields? So could you say something about the economic feasibility?
If you look to if you want to decrease the phosphorus and how to say it, you can't use this water to lower your nutrients on the field if you want to put nutrients on the field. But if you're going to use it for irrigation, we have it's kind of the same costs because you have the same equipment. You have the irrigation pumps and you have all the tubes and you have all the equipment for irrigation. So it's a little bit more expensive to do it from the bottom of the lake to have it up to the intake. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's kind of you use the same equipment, but it's not enough nutrients in the lake generally to for you to be able to lower your fertilization on the field. But you can, it's more of a boost for the lake.
Yeah. So we don't recommend to use this to substitute fertilization,
no.
But
water does that. So you can lower your fertilization amount by just adding more water to the field.
Yeah. And then there is another question. Are there any concerns about heavy metals or other toxic substances, I guess, in the near bottom water?
Yeah, good question, really. We tried it. We tested the sediment and we tested the bottom water. And in this lake, there weren't any problems. But it's important to test it before you do it, of course. But in lakes, yeah, you should test it if you're going to use it for irrigation water.
Yeah, so important to remember for anyone who got really excited about this now.
Yeah, but you can do it. It's just testing, so it's quite easy.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Now we will move on and to the magical and hard to catch stickleback. So Rosita Broström from Fish Farmers Association of Åland, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to speak about the stickleback harvesting pilot project that we did on Åland. And like you said, oh, sorry, didn't know. Is it working now? Yes. Yes. The first question we always get when I mention this project is, why on earth would you want to fish for stickleback? Because there are quite a few challenges with it. It's a very small fish, which makes it hard to catch because you can't catch it with a normal net. And on top of that, it's also a thorny fish. It's got these 3 spikes going up, and that means that when you fish them, they lump together and they get stuck in the net, and they are hard to take care of. So, but even though there are these challenges, there are some good ecological reasons why we still want to try and develop this method, because the stickleback population in the Baltic Sea is estimated to have increased by 50-fold in the last 30 years. So this is a population explosion. And the problem with the increased amount of stickleback is that the adult sticklebacks predate on the juveniles of fish like perch and particularly pike, which means that if there's a lot of sticklebacks, there will be fewer perch and pike. And on top of that, the sticklebacks also predate on benthic fauna and zooplankton, thereby decreasing the predation pressure on phytoplankton, which is algae. So more stickleback also leads to more algae blooms. So we get a double negative effect from the increase. Another important aspect of this pilot project was the socio-economic side. And we thought that stickleback can be a new potential niche for small-scale coastal fishermen that offers job opportunities and income without increasing pressure on the commercial fish populations. And we don't know what the sustainable yield is, but there has been made an estimate that there is at least 25,500 tons per year that is safe to fish. And probably it's a lot more because we don't know enough about the population size yet. Another very important aspect is that stickleback is potentially a new and high quality ingredient for fish feed. It's got a lot of oil, the fish oil, and this and other marine raw materials are a very limited resource globally. So this would be a great addition. And it's also a way of recycling nutrients within the Baltic Sea by removing the stickleback and then adding them to the fish feed that then goes into the farmed fish. So the equipment that we used is a custom-made stickleback seine, and the size of the seine was customized to match the size and capacity of the fishing boats on Åland. But of course we had to do a smaller mesh size in the net to be able to catch the sticklebacks. So it was 10 millimeters squared. And the reason we chose a seine is that it's less tangling and clumping together of the fish, of the sticklebacks compared to trawling. After doing some trials, we had some discussion with the fishermen that participated, and they recommended us to do some modifications. So we did an extension of the arms of the net in order to get greater circumference and to cover a bigger area at the same time. What we also did later on was to add rings and a purse line at the bottom of the net to be able to prevent fish from escaping through the bottom. So these are some pictures from our field work, and it was not always this good weather, but quite often. So it's quite nice doing this field work. And now to the results. It turned out to be quite tricky to do the stickleback fishing, and we had to tweak our fishing methods and make several modifications of the equipment before we got this thing to work, but we figured it out in the end. And the main challenges we had was concerning the hauling technique, preventing fish from escaping, and finding the right time and place for fishing. So about the hauling technique, when we use this kind of small mesh size, the net creates a lot of friction with the water, and this puts a lot of strain on the hauling machines. So it had to be assisted manually, which means we had to help the machine to pull by hand. And when we did this, it was very easy to cause a big mess and entanglement. So it took quite a bit of training before we got the routine to work. And about the fish escaping, it was very frustrating in the beginning because we caught many large schools of stickleback, but we weren't able to pull the seine to pull it together fast enough because of this friction, as I spoke about. And that means that they had time to escape downwards before we closed it. So we then added rings and a purse line, which meant we could close the bottom faster, and that turned out to work really well. And then finding the right time and place, just like Maria said, there's not a lot of stickleback in November. We have tried that as well, and the conclusion was the same, that they migrate out to sea during the winter time. And also what we discovered was that even when there are the juvenile fish, when they are available, they are too small with the net. So we have to focus on the adult stickleback, and the best period for that is April to June. Yeah, and also that the place for fishing, we tried fishing close to the shore as an alternative to the purse line and the rings. But we noticed that even though it prevented escapes, it resulted in bycatches of perch, and this should be avoided. So we chose a different method. So what's next? We tried to make the most out of the time left, so we will do a few more fishing trials, and we will compile our experiences in a manual for future trials or projects. And we are trying to make this project continue, and hopefully there will be a survey to find out more about its ecological impacts, and also a mapping of where, when, and in what amounts we can find them on Åland. We think that if we speculate on the future of stickleback fishing, there will definitely be a commercial fishing of stickleback in some shape or form, at least within the next 10 years. In the Baltic Sea, it will probably be trawling of stickleback as a complementary to the declining fishing quotas of Baltic herring and sprat. And this catch will be used as a compensation measure and a fish feed ingredient. And on Åland, where we will find the small-scale fishing, it will be more about fish habitat restoration, but of course also about compensation measure, and the catch can be used as a fish feed ingredient. So that's about it from me. Any questions?
Thank you, Rosita. We have at least two questions to you. First is, do you know where this mystical creature is during the winter time?
Well, we conclude that since they are not inside the base, they have to be out at sea. And this is what research is suggesting also. So, yeah.
And then the other question, will you try to use even smaller mesh from 6 to 8 millimeters to catch also juveniles?
It would be possible, but like I said, we had to use the technique. We had to sort of modify it to fit the boats and the capacities that we have. And we had 10 millimeters, and it was already quite heavy. So yes, I definitely think that this should be tried, but then that would be in a different setting.
Yeah. And then there is one more question. Was there any bycatch observed when fishing further from the coast?
We never went that far from the coast, but we managed to avoid the bycatches just from staying away from the shallow waters. So just a little bit outside, and we managed to get just stickleback.
Yeah. Otherwise the bycatches would have been enormous, I guess. If you
depends, and also we had a lot of bycatch in the term of sticks and stones and things from the mud from the bottom. So it wasn't really optimal. No.
Yeah. Thank you, Rosita.
Thank you.
Now we will move on, and the next speaker will be Nils Ekeroth from NIRAS, who will take us into the world of marl, or mariel in Swedish. Please, Nils, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Nils Ekeroth. I work as an environmental consultant for NIRAS, and I've been part of this SEABASED project first as a subcontractor for Stockholm University, and I'm now contracted by John Nurminen Foundation to compile the final report for this work package 4, which deals with phosphorus binding in sediment. And this presentation will mostly be about the field trials that were done, but I think before we go into those, I will just say something short also about the marl sorbent that was developed in the project. Yeah, so this sorbent is produced by heat treatment of so-called marl, And marl is essentially a mixture of limestone fragments of relatively small sizes, up to approximately 10 millimeters. And the raw material contain about 92% of calcium carbonate. And these laboratory tests that were performed in the initial stages of the project showed that the heat treatment procedure greatly improved the phosphorus absorption capacity of the marl. And these laboratory tests were carried out by Stockholm University, and they worked in collaboration with the cement producer Cementa on the island of Gotland in Sweden. And this marl also originates from Gotland. Okay, so there were 4 field trials in total. And 2 of these trials were so-called whole bay field trials, where this marl sorbent was spread out over a relatively large area within semi-enclosed bays. So this was done in the Kolka Bay in Finland and in Kyrkviken Bay in Sweden, as Maria mentioned previously. And the main aim of these trials was to lower the phosphate release from oxygen-depleted sediment areas within these bays, and in this way lower the availability of phosphorus in the water. And then the other 2 field trials were carried out in semi-enclosed bays in the Stockholm archipelago in Sweden. But these experiments were carried out on a much smaller scale and with more specific aims on details. I will come back to that. So I will start by presenting some results from these whole bay field trials in Kolka Bay and Kyrkviken Bay. And as I said here, the aim was to reduce phosphate release from oxygen-depleted sediment areas and thereby counteract eutrophication. And in both cases, the marl spreading was done by helicopter. So these are maps of the Kyrkviken Bay on the left and the Kolka Bay on the right. And these striped areas in the map show the treatment area of each bay. So they constitute the deepest parts of the bay, of the bays, and which are then impacted by oxygen depletion in the deep water. And the Kyrkviken field trial was the first one, and then the Kolka Bay field trial was started about 1 year later. So these are some of the results from the monitoring programs. The upper panel here shows oxygen concentrations in the deep water of each bay, with the day of the year on the x-axis, and the lower panels show phosphate concentration in deep water. And then the different colored markers are for different years. And the orange dotted vertical lines here show then when the spreading of marl was performed. And basically, this data shows that the seasonal deep water oxygen depletion was happening in these bays every year, and that these periods of very low oxygen concentrations in the deep water that correlates then with a buildup of phosphate also in the deep water. So there's a buildup of the phosphate concentration during this time. But we see no indication that this buildup of phosphate is any different after the marl spreading. So there's no real sign of a long-term effect by the marl. But if we go into detail, we see, as Maria also mentioned, that initially when the marl was spread out, there was the phosphate concentration was lowered instantly, more or less. So there is a potential short-term effect of this marl sorbent. But just as we saw in the Kolka Bay here, the concentration increased very rapidly again. So this is, of course, just a small fraction of the data which is available, but the other types of data also point in the same direction. Okay, then we come to these small trials outside Stockholm and the Djupsjön Bay field trial. And our aim here was to investigate effects in the sediment by the treatment with marl. And our hypothesis was that the addition of marl sorbent to sediment in this oxygen depleted bay would then increase the total amount of phosphorus in the sediment due to the increased phosphorus binding. And we also wanted to measure the change in pH that would occur due to this addition, and also see how much the calcium concentration increased. And I don't have time now to go into the details here, but the results show that the marl sorbent resulted in a small change in pH, a small increase, and also increased the calcium concentration in the treated sediment. But it had no effect on the phosphorus content. And then the last field trial was in the Farstaviken Bay, also outside Stockholm. And here we basically wanted to determine why the sorbent appeared to have lower efficiency in the field than from the laboratory studies that were done before. And to achieve this, we used a kind of experimental bottle shown in the top picture here, where we placed small amounts of marl in these bottles, and also tried different size classes of the marl sorbent. We made a large hole in the lids of each bottle and put a netted mesh under the lid to allow for water exchange. And then these bottles were deployed about 1 meter above the seafloor in this Farstaviken Bay in oxygen-free and very phosphate-rich conditions. And then these bottles were out for between 13 and 32 days. So the sorbent that we use is meant to disintegrate into a fine-grained powder or fine-grained matter after some time in water. But when we took these bottles up, we noted directly that the only part of the material had been pulverized as intended. And then we also analyzed the phosphorus content of both of the fine-grained matter then in the bottles and also the larger particles. And we found that the fine-grained matter was clearly enriched in phosphorus, while the large particles had a much lower phosphorus content. But even though this fine-grained material was enriched in phosphorus, the concentrations were between 50 and 100 times lower than what would be expected from the adsorption studies in the lab. So we can conclude then that the sorbent that we used has the capacity to bind phosphorus, but this capacity is lower than anticipated. And the relatively low capacity then to bind phosphorus explain the lack of positive results in the other field trials. So how can this low efficiency be explained? And we think that the most likely reason is related to the production of marl here, the marl sorbent, or more specifically the differences in when we produce the marl for the laboratory studies and for the field studies. So for the laboratory study, the marl sorbent was produced more or less by hand on a very small scale and under very controlled conditions. And then for the field trials, the production had to be scaled up, and it seems likely that we were not successful to reproduce the right conditions in the furnace used for this field trial marl. We can also conclude that there were no harmful effects observed during this field trials. There were no large pH increases or clouding or dusting or other things like that. And looking ahead, I think the most critical step now should be to optimize the large-scale production method for this sorbent. And actually, this is already a project which is planned for in 2021, this year. I also think in retrospect that it might have been a too large step to go directly from the laboratory studies to relatively large-scale field trials. So I think in the future, like mesocosm scale experiments should be considered before additional large-scale field trials are performed, just to verify the sorbent capacity of this marl. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels. There is at least one question. I'm just reading it. I don't know if I understand it, but maybe you understand it. Is the low pulverization rate related to some kind of coating with natural DOM?
Yeah, dissolved organic matter. So no, I don't think that's the reason. I think the reason what we saw was that the larger particles in this of the marl sorbent was kind of the outer part of the particle was turned into fine grained material, while the core of the particles were intact. And I think this has to do with the heat treatment, actually, that we the cores of the particles were not treated with this in the same way as the outer shell, so to say.
Yes, there is another question, which is there are more questions, but let's take some. Do you consider this as a cost-efficient method?
Well, not with this sorption capacity, maybe. I mean, now it's not very, it didn't really work, but in principle, if it's possible to make this heat treatment cost efficient, I think that the raw material is more or less, it has a very, very low cost, at least in the present. If we go on the adsorption capacity that we measure in the lab, I think definitely could be a very cost-efficient measure.
Yeah. Then, do you need a lot of energy to produce more? What are the climate effects?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't really have an answer to how much energy that will be required. And the climate effects also is of course related to that, and of course also when during the heat treatment there is a release of carbon dioxide from the marl sorbent, and I think the weight reduction during this treatment is around like 15%. So yeah, and that's carbon dioxide which is then being released. And I think Cementa, the cement producer where the marl was treated, I mean, they have plans for the future to do this carbon capture and to have no emissions of carbon dioxide, but presently they have, I mean, high releases of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, and I can also tell to all the listeners that this aspect will also be covered we will make this like final output of this project, which is the guidelines document. Nina will be talking about this later on, but we will also cover this aspect on marl on this document. So this information will be available. Thank you, Niels.
Okay,
now, last but not least, we will have a presentation by Irma Puttonen from Center for Economic Development, Transport and the Environment of Southwestern Finland. So Irma, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjukka. Kirsi, I kindly ask you to take control of the slides, please. I'll tell you when to change. My name is Irma Puttonen. I work at the Center for Economic Development, Transport and the Environment for Southwestern Finland, the ELY Center. On our responsibility was the sediment removal pilot, and you will now hear about that. Thank you. First, we defined preconditions for the pilot site. Then we went out to the sea and checked nearly 70 bays and depressions in the archipelago sea. We explored the water depth, looked at the sediment and took water samples. We found a suitable place, Åraksvik in Hotskär, which is marked with the red asterisk on the map. It is located about 100 kilometers from Turku. There's road and ferry connection to the island. And why we thought Åraksvik is a suitable place for the sediment removal pilot? We saw the symptoms of eutrophication in the bay. In the mouth of the bay, there is a threshold that hinders water flow into and from the bay. There are 2 anoxic depressions about 12 meters deep and 1 hectare in area each. There is oxygen deficiency and high phosphorus concentration in the water, indicating phosphorus release from the sediment. There are intense algal blooms in the summer and no bottom animals in the deep anoxic areas. Locals say that former timber handling onshore has deteriorated the water quality when loads of timber has sunken to the bottom of the bay. There's an active water protection group in Hochar, and they provided monitoring data from previous projects. And what is really important, we had excellent cooperation with local people, and even a contact person who helped us with organizing information events, spreading proper information and killing misinformative rumors and so on. That was really valuable. Next slide, please. We explored thoroughly possible options to implement the pilots. We wanted to find out what kind of technique is available to remove smoothly just the very loose uppermost 10 centimeters of the sediment, how it could be dewatered before deposition because lots of water would come with the sediment, and if the sediment or the nutrients in it could be recycled. I traveled to Jönköping to see how they do similar work in a small lake. This picture is of their equipment, and it has worked well there in smaller scale. But as one could expect, we encountered some challenges or even difficulties. Isn't it the nature of a pilot project? Marine scale is quite different from inland lakes. It's hard to find a small, shallow and enclosed bay that is also reachable. Suitable places can be really remote, difficult to reach and without any infrastructure. Transporting equipment to remote places takes time and money, and same applies to constructing required infra at the dredging and deposition place. The shores in the archipelago are in many cases steep cliffs, or there are privately owned fields and the owners don't always welcome sediment on their property. Dewatering the sediment is not simple either. Fine clay particles settle slowly, so if we would use settling containers, we'd need a lot of space and time. Then if we wanted to filter out the water, tiny flat clay particles tend to block filters. Removing nutrients from the discharge water is expensive, particularly nitrogen removing. Also, lack of competition drives prices up. New technical solutions and more competition are needed to reduce the price. And next, please. Before starting public procurement process for the pilot implementation, we published market consultation as we were hoping to find out solutions and the prices in the markets. In the end, we had to conclude that the cost of the plant work is too high. Then we decided, after negotiations with the financier, to find a contractor to do a sediment incubation test in a lab. Dr. Jouni Lehtoranta, who is an expert in our steering group, designed an experiment that would provide information of the effects of sediment removal on sediment oxygen consumption and nutrient fluxes between the sediment and water. And this would give us a theoretical estimate whether sediment removal could improve water quality. Next, please. Yes. The results of the test show that BOD7 declined with sediment depth. It was measured from sediment samples of different depths in the sediment, and it indicates how much oxygen microorganisms need for breakdown of organic matter in 7 days. And sediment removal from the test tubes actually moderated oxygen demand. 25 centimeter sediment removal lowered phosphate concentrations in the water, whereas 5 or 15 centimeter removal showed less clear change, if any. The thickness of homogeneous organic-rich sediment in the test area, that is Åland, was 25 to 30 centimeters. So these results suggest that removing all the organic-rich sediment might improve water quality. Change in phosphate concentration in the overlying water depended on the initial concentration in the test. For nitrogen concentration, the test didn't show detectable trend. Next, please. I calculated theoretical amounts of nutrient removal based on Åland sediment and water data. You can click, please. 150 kilos of phosphorus per hectare, 1,150 kilos of nitrogen, and 7,900 kilograms of carbon. And that OC stands for organic carbon, which is almost the same. Sediment phosphorus content vary quite a lot across the archipelago sea, and the amount of removed phosphorus is very much site dependent, but these are calculated based on Åland data. Next, please. About sustainability, I just put some aspects here. It can be of concern when we touch sensitive marine ecosystems. For sustainable implementation of the pilot, we explore different aspects, and I think Mäki will enlighten those more thoroughly later in this meeting. This kind of measure, although it is quite drastic, can still be implemented sustainably. It is not a problem. With careful planning and consideration, the problems lie elsewhere. And next, please. Our conclusions in a nutshell about sediment removal are these. Several issues make sediment removal too expensive method at present. One is marine scale, depth and extent of areas where sediment removal could be done. Transportation equipment and possibly sediment out, as well as constructing infra for the works, are costly. Thin sediment surface layer would not be enough to have any effect on water quality. More intensive dredging would mean consideration of ecological sustainability twice. We need new technical solutions. Further, sediment deposition and recycling need affordable solutions. Removing nutrients from the discharge water is possible but expensive, especially nitrogen removal. Geotubes could be used, for example, as landfill, flood defense and so on, but the price of the whole process must come down. And our take-home message is we need new affordable technical solutions to all phases if we want to make sediment removal a practicable and relevant method for removing nutrients in local scale from the Baltic Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Irma.